This time we're freeze drying potatoes. I've been looking forward to this because it's something that I've never done before, but I really wanted to try it in a couple of different ways. A lot of the videos that I found online prior to doing this test were a lot about blanching the potatoes prior to actually freeze drying them. From what I understand, you're supposed to start the cooking process before you freeze dry them. That's supposed to help prevent them from turning black. For part of this test, I actually want to try a small batch of potatoes that have not been blanched or baked at all. So we're not going to start the cooking process on them at all before freeze drying them. Primarily, I just want to test this so that I can see if they really do turn black like people say. What we're going to be doing with the potatoes is I have 4 different ways that I want to prepare them, and we're going to just test those 4 different methods and see how they turn out. I've got cubed potatoes, which is how my family usually eats them. We just leave the skin on, we cube them, and then I turn them into some sort of potato hash, or we'll throw them in the oven and bake them. We'll do it a number of different ways. The other 3 batches are going to be fries. I'm gonna do shredded for hash browns, and then I'm gonna do 1 more set of cubed potatoes, but skins off this time. And then of course that last smaller batch is gonna be cubed without skins, but I'm not gonna cook them in advance. The method that I'm going to use is I'm actually gonna throw the potatoes, once they're prepped, into the oven for about 10 minutes at 375 to get that cooking process started. I'll include a link in the description on where I found that video originally and the woman who recommended that method. To get started, we're going to peel all of our potatoes. Only 1 of the 4 batches is actually going to have the skins left on. My thinking behind this came from a few posts that I saw where they were talking about how the skins tended to reconstitute to be a little bit on the chewy side. So I do want to actually test this to see how chewy and what that's like. But the majority of the test, I wanted it to be something a little bit more tried and true from what I'd seen and just take the skins off. In an effort to clean up as little mess as possible, I'm just going to stick these in the oven using my freeze dryer trays and let them cool fully before I actually put them into my freeze dryer. When it came to the hash browns, I kind of paid attention to what the prep process would be if I were making hash browns from scratch. So I went ahead and wrung out as much of the liquid from the hash browns as I could before ever putting them onto the freeze dry tray, thinking that might help with the freeze drying process. Here's that tray that I added the uncooked potatoes to. Everything above the line is what went into the oven for 10 minutes, and everything below is just raw potato. In total, these were in the freeze dryer for 39 hours. Towards the end, I did pull them out twice to weigh them and make sure they weren't losing any more weight, and once that happened, I counted them completed and pulled them out. This is not what I expected. If you guys remember, before I stuck these in the freeze dryer, I decided at last second to add in a potato that hadn't been put in the oven to bake, and I didn't blanch it. I didn't blanch any of these, but from what I had heard, the potatoes turn black if you put them in the freeze dryer before they actually have a chance to be baked a little bit or start that cooking process through blanching. But this line right here, these are the unbaked, and then this is all baked. So you can see it's a little yellower where it was baked, but this I expected to turn black and it didn't change at all. So I'm gonna actually jar these separately so that I can kind of keep an eye on them and see if maybe the black process takes some time and maybe it'll happen in the jars over the next couple of days. But for now, everything else turned out beautifully. We can try one of the fries and they just snap perfectly. I'm not seeing any in here that are still soft. The thick ones all look finished. The shredded for hash browns, I kind of figured these would probably work out the best just because they're the thinnest. These little burn spots aren't from the freeze dryer. It's actually from the oven when I stuck it in at 375 for 10 minutes. They got a little crispy on the edges. And it looks like the ones with skins turned out fine too. I worried maybe they would take longer to freeze dry, but they are perfectly crunchy and crispy. I've decided I'm going to start putting all of my food in jars, at least anything that I plan on using in the near future, which because of the videos is quite a bit of it, because we're going to do some videos on how to reconstitute this and actually use them in your cooking. So we're moving on to jars instead of Mylar bags, so I'm not just wasting Mylar bags that are going to get opened, used, and then tossed. I've heard some people wash them and reuse them. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that. I would worry about them not being fully sanitized properly. And then dried properly before I use them again. So there's a couple factors that make me hesitant, but instead I would rather use jars, and then I can just wash and reuse them without having to waste Mylar bags. But of course I will use Mylar bags if I'm freeze drying something that's going to be used much further into the future, but the jars should last, I think people say, about 3 to 5 years. These are surprisingly softer. Like, they just kind of crumble, the uncooked ones, whereas the cooked ones are, can't do that one because it's too small, are crispy. That's interesting. I'd be curious to see how these rehydrate differently. To finish these up, I have an oxygen absorber. We're going to drop into each one, and then I'm going to vacuum seal the jars. The oxygen absorber is supposed to help keep out the oxygen, whereas the vacuum seal is supposed to help with the air in the jar. So the vacuum seal doesn't do anything for the oxygen, which is why we still stick those in. I say this like I know what I'm talking about, but really it's just me regurgitating something I read online. So in my mind, it can't hurt to do both. I know some people choose one or the other, but I would rather make sure we're covered. In upcoming videos, I'm going to be reconstituting each of these, testing for a variety of different things. If you want to learn more about freeze drying while I learn right alongside you, be sure you follow along. Today we're rehydrating raw potatoes. First of all, these turned out really delicate and crumbly after freeze drying, so we're going to rehydrate them just by spritzing some water. They did turn black from oxidization. That's not unexpected because I didn't do any pre-cooking, though they didn't really soak up water with the spritz like I'd hoped. It was really only where the water touched, which made for a lot of dry spots, so I did wind up soaking half the batch as well. Once I was done rehydrating them, I cooked them in a little oil, some seasonings, and it was time to taste. We'd give these a 2 out of 10. They were super chewy and spongy, though that's not surprising since I didn't cook them in any way prior to freeze drying. This time we're rehydrating potatoes that were baked in the oven for just 10 minutes before being freeze dried. To get started, I wanted to test both hot and cold submersions. Obviously, the hot submersion was a lot faster, needing to soak for only about 10 minutes, whereas the cold took about 20. Once they were fully rehydrated, I dried them off with a paper towel and then cooked them with a little bit of oil and some seasonings. The end result was a little chewy, though frying in oil did help a little bit. I will still be looking for alternative ways to freeze dry potatoes though, to see if I can get a better outcome in the future.